what's wrong with annual performance reviews? Well, quite frankly, they are broken. The annual performance conversation just doesn't cut it anymore. Now, to be fair, there are some organisations that actually do have this nailed. They do it well, they have great conversations, and they are, in fact, developing the performance of their people. However, unfortunately, that is the exception rather than the rule. So what we find is that typically the annual performance conversation is not delivering results, it's time consuming, it's an administrative burden, and people, frankly, they hate it. So let's look at this from three levels, from the individual level, the management level, and the organisational perspective. So let's take the individual level. When the team manager or the team member turns up to a performance conversation, typically they're not expecting to actually get any value from that conversation. And that's really quite sad. What they realise is it's more of a tick the box exercise, more of an admin exercise than it is anything to do with actually impacting their performance or developing any new skills. It's also something where we find that research suggests that only 8% of HR executives surveyed by Deloitte recently suggested that there's any value in the actual performance conversation. 8%, that is not very much at all. And in fact, 58% suggested that they find it not an effective use of time. So no wonder the employee feels like it's an administrative exercise and a tick the box exercise more than it is anything to do with actually developing performance. So let's look at it from the management perspective, the person delivering the performance conversation. Typically what we see here again is that they also feel it's a bit of a tick the box exercise. It creates a lot of extra work for them. They have to prepare for the interviews, they have to have the interviews, and then they have to input a whole lot of data into the system. So again, administrative burden. And also there's a feeling that the conversation is something that's on top of their real work. So it feels like there's a whole lot of extra work that they're required to do, and that shouldn't actually be the case, but unfortunately it feels that way. And the third part of that is also sometimes managers don't feel prepared for these conversations because they don't feel like they have the right skills to be having these kinds of conversations. In fact, there was some research done by the Korn Ferry Institute that suggests that developing the performance of others, or growing talent as they called it, was rated number 67 out of 67 important management capabilities. So what that's saying is that out of all the things managers need to do, growing the talent within their teams is the last thing that they're really good at doing. So that doesn't bode well for the effectiveness of these annual conversations. And thirdly, if we take it from an organisational perspective, what we find is that organisations are finally starting to wise up to the reality of these annual conversations. They're taking heed of all the research that's out there at the moment. Deloitte's recently published something suggesting that, in fact, 70% of organisations are starting to ditch the annual conversation. They're either ditching it right now or they've already ditched it. So we're looking at big names like NAB and Deloitte. Oh, obviously, they've done the research, Deloitte. Organisations like Adobe and Juniper Networks, they're all starting to make this transition. And really, the bottom line is, imagine if you had a sporting team. So I like to use this analogy with my clients. Imagine you've got a sporting team and they're an elite sporting team. Maybe it's AFL or NRL or something. And you decide that you're only going to give them feedback once a year. Once a year, just before the grand final, is the time to line everyone up and say, okay, so Johnny, you did fabulous, great kicks, good. You could do your handballs a little bit better, and so on and so forth. Now, obviously this analogy is a bit tongue-in-cheek because it's so ridiculous. You would never give people feedback once a year if they're an elite sporting team. And yet we do this in business all the time. Why? Why do we think it's appropriate to have one conversation once a year and think that that's going to impact the performance of our people? It just doesn't make any sense.